over. One of the major tenets of the EU was to enhance cooperation and mutual prosperity, but we will argue that prosperity has been experienced by very few, while the peripheral countries have been left in the wind, tripled with unemployment, slow growth, and have been bullied by the big brother in Brussels. Our analysis on why the EU will fail and why it will happen in the next couple of decades comes down to three main themes: sovereignty, economy, and democracy. The EU over the past decades has become the symbol of globalization and liberalization. Sadly, these are two values which are on the chopping block of many member states. Marine Le Pen, the French presidential candidate, was quoted just a couple of weeks back. The French have been dispossessed of their patriotism. They are suffering in silence from not being allowed to love their country. The divide is no longer between the left and the right, but between patriotists and globalists. This is not a new phenomenon. This tension has been brewing for quite some time. Even Poland opted to opt out of the EU's 2009 Charter of Fundamental Rights because they feared they would have to give equal benefits to homosexual couples. And while the House believes that fundamental rights for all has to be implemented, it still is important to recognize that some countries can view legislation as contradictory to their culture, values, history, and sovereignty. But unfortunately, this imposition goes further than just fundamental rights. The EU has been accused of exploiting poorer members and adopting EU policies. Portugal, for example, voted against the EU-mandated austerity measures in the Constitutional Court, but the Portuguese government was pressured by the EU officials to ignore the ruling under the threat of losing badly needed funds. France, Netherlands, Italy, Austria, Finland, Hungary, Portugal, and Slovakia all want to hold referendums to leave EU. That's the EU's blatant infringement on member states' sovereignty will undoubtedly push nations away from economic liberalization and closer to realist policies. All good things must come to an end. And my friend, the end is near. Thank you.
One, past hardships in the European Union have led to further integration, from the World War II, of course, to Eastern European peace with the enlargement in 2004, with the accession of Croatia in 2013. But even with the financial crisis, it has made us Europeans come together in a way that we haven't come together in the past. We now have the European Stability Mechanism since 2012, which what some people think that it's the lender of last resort to some extent in Europe. We never had that before, but also more political integration. We now have the European External Action Service, which is the foreign ministry of the EU, that coordinates foreign policy for European countries. Our generation, and this is our second argument, is actually the most confident in the EU. And I can tell you from a personal story. So I come from the southeast region of Spain, Andalusia, and I didn't really know what was to be European when I was in Spain. I was raised there until I was 17. It was only when I worked at the European Parliament, when I worked for the EAS, when I came to America, that I started realizing that there's something bigger than Spain, and that's Europe. Actually, if we look at the data, the Eurobarometer, for example, it is our generation, the young people here, that think that the EU will integrate farther. What does Europe mean for us? It means the possibility of working abroad, the possibility of studying abroad, the possibility of moving around different European countries without having to use your passport. We are also more confident in European institutions than in the past. Our third argument is based on the fact that we think that the European Union will integrate farther. It's not going to disappear. It's not going to just be dismantled. It's not going to stay the way it is. It is a dynamic union in the end, but it will integrate farther. We already have plans to form a defense union. It's very easy to get caught up in the media. We did it for Brexit, we did it for Trump. Let's not do it for Europe. Let's look at the facts, let's listen to people, let's talk to each other. I actually just came from The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, and the guest speaker was Jake Tapper. He's an anchor at CNN. And other than complaining about last night's Trump speech, he also said that the media is not really relying on the facts. Today, my team and myself, we are going to present the facts. Why the EU will survive.
And it's not too difficult if you look at the facts to see how the party is over. The first main issue, and I'm just going to talk about it a little bit, is the euro. Obviously, the euro is a huge problem. And I think it's interesting that you're all from countries in the south, even though big countries from the south, but that's still, because the euro is affecting poor countries from the south that are suffering stress, economic stress. And that is quite clear, and that is quite basic economics. When a country has some economic problems, one of the solutions to the crisis is usually to devalue its currency or to default. And that makes the country more competitive, destroys the industries that are not competitive, and instead, it allows the country to build a new productive infrastructure. That's not what's happening right now, especially in Greece. Can you hold this? And I'm going to expand to Spain, even though it's growing. However, like if you look at the unemployment figures in Greece, in Spain, youth unemployment, like let's take the case of Greece and Spain. They have 40% youth unemployment. The people that are going to decide the future of the European Union is currently unemployed. That's a huge argument for like in 20 years, these people that are 25 are going to be 45, and they're going to be the people that vote. And these people that are suffering in this case, it's what happened in the UK, it's what's happening in France. What you see is what happened in the US. What you're seeing is these people that are suffering, at one point they decide, okay, I'm not going to stuck with this anymore. And I don't want these austerity measures. I want something different. And I think that that is, honestly, one of the biggest arguments for the EU. Okay, if they're going to survive, how are you going to survive? How is Greece going to go back to growth? One issue that I think is very important about this, and that is, not only you have to have similar type of policies, but you also need similar tax regulation. And you're having extremely difficult tax regulation, different tax regulation. In fact, you're having Luxembourg next to France, and it's the exact opposite. And the president of the European Commission was the former prime minister of Luxembourg that was helping companies get into Luxembourg to avoid paying taxes. It's quite strong. People are going to start thinking, hey, I want my well-being instead of the European Union and instead of Brussels' well-being. And that's my message.
The European Union that was born around 60 years ago was the opportunity for our grandparents and the parents of our grandparents to build a place of peace and prosperity after the devastation of World War II. But now, if I want to enter into the facts, as we were saying, 73% of Europeans want a common European policy for migration, 74% a common defense policy, 66% a common foreign policy, 72% a common energy policy, 81% feel 81% are in favor of free movement, and 67% feel citizens of the EU. You were talking about economy and about economic facts, how the European Union has put a lot of pressure on the border peripheral states. The question is, why Greece hasn't gone out? They could have. No? I mean, they had a quite left-leaning candidate, was not in favor of European liberalism, and he still decided to stay. Because he recognized that the benefits that the European Union was giving to the Greek citizens were bigger than the benefits that they could obtain.
Don't you think this is more of a dependency issue as opposed to them wanting to be in the EU? The EU is holding them hostage with funding and bailouts and benefits. And that's the thing about sovereignty. And the comparison that you have done between the European Union and the USSR and Yugoslavia. I'm afraid to say, every European country is free to enter and to leave. The case is Brexit. They have decided that they wanted to leave. So there is no country that is hostage to Brussels and to the EU. Every country has the possibility under the Treaty of Lisbon to exit the European Union, and we are seeing it right now.
So the European Union is a very peaceful union of states and really happy together, and no one complains about anything. Is everything? My point is.
Think about it.
My question is this: like you point, like we understand the difference, but do you acknowledge that there are some problems with the European Union and some people are complaining about them?
Are there not problems in the U.S.? I mean, are there not conflicts between the state, between the states and the federal government? You were talking about taxes. I mean, taxes in the U.S. What about New York taxes versus Delaware taxes? Are they not different? And they're next to each other. I mean, I think it's something that any federal union faces. I mean, look at the case of Spain. We have different regions with different taxes. In the case of Germany,
Look at the UK, between England and Gibraltar. You're talking about Marine Le Pen, and I'm afraid to say that Marine Le Pen is not the product of the European Union. It's a product of a very dark time in Europe. And it was a time when nationalism blinded Europe. It was a time that hopefully, with the European Union now in place, has been overcome. May I say, we all hear about these countries that they're supposed that they want to leave the European Union. Poland, Hungary, the Netherlands. Actually, those, like Poland and Hungary, are the most pro-European countries that we can find nowadays. The Netherlands have more trust in EU institutions than in their own institutions.
I want to remind both the opposition and the audience that the House doesn't hate the EU or wish for it to collapse, but we are simply trying to showcase that concerns on sovereignty, the economy, which they haven't touched on, and the political landscape are adding pressure to what is already a very fragile and weak region. The opposition has painted an interesting picture highlighting the past successes of the EU. The opposition spoke of the Croatian success, post-World War II economic integration and prosperity, Eastern European peace. But these are in the past, and we must look to the future and admit that the world is changing, politics are changing, and people are changing. And this brings us to our final argument, which is democracy and politics. The EU is supposed to be a Class A example of a liberal, democratic region. But unfortunately, this is just not the case. Eurosceptics are grabbing hold of the bureaucracy and the inefficiency in the Union to propel its cause.
The EU budget is 1% of the national GDP. Why is it too bureaucratic?
Okay, I'll get into that. How could you even say that the EU is not bureaucratic? But anyways, Boris Johnson has described the EU as a dysfunctional bureaucracy that has no proper democratic oversight. And I agree, like, I don't like to use Boris Johnson as my sole source of information. But even if you think that this statement is exaggerated, you have to recognize that he's not the only one that feels this way. Clearly, even Joe Stiglitz, our very own, has written that the EU suffers from a severe democratic deficit. Slovakian president, a longtime supporter of the EU, worries that current union behaviors are threatening domestic political systems. He is characterized as a nationalist and illiberal leader in the eyes of the EU, and he has warned that the union will not survive if they don't learn to accept democratically elected leaders such as himself. But Slovakia is not the only illiberal democracy on the bloc. And with French and German and Dutch elections around the corner, that list could get longer. The EU is supposed to be the guardian of democracy, and of course only democratic states are allowed to enter the EU. But what has the EU done when its member states have backslided on democratic values? Nothing. In the case of Poland, which recently their government gave themselves the authority to hire and fire executives at television and radio stations, which is in contradictory to EU law. Sure, there's an investigation. The EU can impose Article 7, which would impose sanctions on Poland or suspend their voting rights. But they've done neither of those things. And it's not just the Boris Johnsons and Le Pens of the world that warn that the end is near. The opposition spoke about how countries are so confident in EU institutions, but you actually have members of EU Parliament that are screaming out saying, this is a failed oligarchy. The European Parliament's undemocratic nature has pushed Great Britain out the door, and there's fear that they'll do the same to others. But my question to the opposition is this. If EU institutions are so strong, so mighty, then why does a few election cycles have the entire globe on the edge of their seats? The future of the EU will be determined in the next few months with just 3 elections. Imagine what's going to happen in the next 20 years with dozens more. And what started off with the best of intentions has spiraled into a dying experiment where countries are getting pushed further and further away. We've showcased explicitly that the EU has infringed on member states' sovereignty with threats and intimidation, and that in a 20-year period, more countries will reject this behavior. We've demonstrated that the EU and the euro, which the opposition has not touched on, has betrayed its members by failing to bring them out of what is going on a 10-year period of weakness and economic travesty. And lastly, the EU is no longer the protector or pinnacle of democracy. The EU will not survive.
Let's do a simple exercise. How many of you guys would like to have its own country to face 70 years of peace? You just have to sign a document right now and say, I want 70 years of peace without any interruption. But it seems like something 95%, 98%. My grandfather.
Why didn't the economic integration in the late 19th century and early 20th century prevent the atrocities of World War I?
Because there was no European Union. My grandfather, my great-grandfather, during World War I, got a medal because he fought against the Austrians. I would never think even raising, like even possible to raise my hands against a fellow European. It is simply unthinkable for my generation. We are brothers, we are family. We share the same values. We move forward together. People move freely within our countries. Democratic values were spread thanks to this absence of barriers. Spain, Portugal, Greece, they passed from an authoritarian ruling to a democratic regime under the European Union with the support of the European Union. Just because people were able to communicate their values. Finally, we have something that only Europeans share. There is a European identity. How many of you guys would love to feel part of something that unites you with neighboring countries? It's really peculiar how people that are not from Europe can think that this amazing institution that shaped our lives, the life of our fathers, the dream of our grandfathers, could be brought down by 8 years of economic crisis. This is a work of centuries. It's not going to be done because we stagnate for 5 years while some of our countries are growing tremendously.
One person that's going to be in 10 years, 30 years old, is not going to remember Second World War because it was in 1945. So my point about this is, if you look at the past, yes, you can find some achievements. The problem is, what are you going to do for the future after you had 8 awful years?
Okay,
how are you going to solve the problems of the economy?
Okay, so, like, have you ever seen, like, the Monty Python sketch of what have the Romans done for us?
No, what?
Okay.
Hold on. For my question,
sorry, you asked the question. Let me answer.
But I answered 10 seconds. I forgot. How do you know? I'm also going to answer.
Please answer. No, sorry.
So, what have the Romans done for us? Except 70 years of peace, except building roads, except doubling our GDPs, except having a common
The past.
What? Okay, sorry. Have you ever lived a devaluation? You are talking about.
Yes,
Please.
Sorry, guys. Have you ever lived like U.S. people? Have you ever lived a devaluation that your money is worth like twice or 3 times less the next day because the government decided that it needs to do that for like make competitive your economy? Is that the way you want to, in the type of country you want to live, in which your currency the next day isn't worth anything, and if you want to store value, you need to store it in dollars? Because that was the case of Spain in the 90s. You talk about the economy. The Spanish economy is growing at the 3% rate right now. It grew at the 2.8% last year. And the unemployment, that you talk a lot about it went down from 27 to 19% in 2 years. The question is, would Spain be able to achieve that without the European Union? Would the Eastern European countries be able to do the infrastructure projects that they have without the European Union funds? I mean, even they say oh, big countries, they don't want to give money to the peripheral countries. I'm sorry, I was in Guadeloupe 1 month ago. The island, French territory. The roads I was traveling in were paid by EU funds. French country. I mean, What has the EU done for us in the economy? Economic treaties? Canada? Like a single market? No taxes? I mean, I agree. What has the European Union done for us?
So much. We've heard a lot about facts tonight, even more so about the economy, but we all know we're living in an era of alternative facts. And what really swings public opinion are emotions, feelings. So I wonder whether you think that this is going to work for or against the survival of the European Union.
What we're hearing from the opposition is that there's this fairy tale environment where Swedes are marrying Germans and all of this, whatever. But the reality of the matter is that you're right. It's based a lot on feelings and emotions and fear, and that's what we're seeing coming out of the EU. You can parade, you know, whatever 75% or whatever you said is in favor of a unified migration policy, but is that what we actually think? Is that what we're actually reading?
Yeah, for sure there is, to answer your point, there is a part of the European population that are against the European Union. And of course, you read this on newspapers, but this part of the population is probably less than 25% of the overall population. This is just one party in the national political spectrum. So even in Italy, we have a big party that is Eurosceptic, but it's like 22% of the population. All the other parties represent Europe. So yeah, the narrative is that there is a big party, but this big party cannot change the rule of the game. People are